On the afternoon of April 16th, 1945, in the western German town of Iserlohn, a remarkable column came rumbling into the town square. At its head were the surviving Jagdtiger tank destroyers of the 512th Heavy Anti-Tank Battalion, almost 80-ton steel monsters mounting the most powerful anti-tank gun of the war. Their commander was Captain Albert Ernst, a holder of the Knight's Cross, known to his men as the Tiger of Vitebsk for his exploits on the Eastern Front. Ernst had chosen to surrender his command rather than see the city destroyed in a final pointless battle. They were not running, they were not fighting, they were surrendering. Soldiers of the United States, 99th Infantry Division, watched them approach, rifles ready but lowered. The Germans dismounted, formed up, and laid down their weapons. Officers in tattered field grey turned over their pistols. Enlisted men dropped rifles, machine guns, and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons into a growing pile. The scene was filmed by an American Signal Corps crew, and the footage survives today, a record of one of the strangest moments of the war. Within 48 hours, more than 300,000 German soldiers would surrender inside what the Allies were calling the Ruhr Pocket. It was the largest mass capitulation of German troops on the Western Front during the entire Second World War. The man who commanded them, Field Marshal Walter Model, would not be among the prisoners. 3 days later, alone in a forest near Duisburg, he would shoot himself rather than face captivity. But for the men he left behind, the men walking out of the rubble with their hands raised, surrender was not a defeat. It was a deliverance. They had done everything in their power to make sure the soldiers receiving them wore American uniforms and not Soviet ones. This is the story of why. The German soldier of 1945 was, by any military standard, one of the most experienced fighting men in the world. The Wehrmacht had been at war for nearly 6 years. Its veterans had marched into Poland in 1939, swept across France in 1940, plunged deep into the Soviet Union in 1941. They had fought in the deserts of North Africa, the mountains of Italy, the forests of Belarus, the steppes of Ukraine. By the spring of 1945, those who remained were among the hardest, most battle-hardened soldiers ever to wear a uniform. The German army at its peak had numbered over 13 million men under arms. Its divisions were organized with meticulous precision. Its officer corps trained according to a doctrine called Auftragstaktik, which gave junior commanders unusual freedom to make decisions in the heat of battle. Its weapons were among the most advanced in the world. The Mauser Karabiner 98 rifle had been refined over decades. The MG-42 machine gun fired so rapidly, its reports blurred into a single tearing sound that Allied soldiers nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw. The Panther and Tiger tanks were feared across every front, their armor and guns superior in many ways to anything the Allies could field in equal numbers. The men who operated these weapons had absorbed the brutal lessons of total war. They had learned how to dig in under artillery fire that lasted for hours. They had learned how to ambush armored columns with handheld rocket launchers called Panzerfausts. They had learned to fight in cities and forests and frozen marshes, in temperatures that froze breath into ice on their collars, and in summer heat that turned tank interiors into ovens. They were professionals at killing and at staying alive, and by 1945 they understood war with a clarity that men in 1939 could never have imagined. The German army had also pioneered or refined many of the operational techniques that defined modern warfare. Combined arms doctrine, in which infantry, armor, artillery, and air power moved together in mutually supporting roles, had been demonstrated to devastating effect in the campaigns of 1939 and 1940. The concept of the Schwerpunkt, the focal point of attack, allowed German commanders to concentrate overwhelming force at decisive places along an enemy line. The Wehrmacht had also developed a culture of rapid command decision-making, in which orders were transmitted as mission objectives rather than as detailed instructions, allowing subordinate officers to adapt to local conditions without waiting for permission from above. These doctrinal innovations were not unique to Germany. The Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain all developed comparable techniques over the course of the war, and in many ways exceeded German capability by 1944. But the German soldier of the late war had been raised inside this system, trained in it, and shaped by it. Even in retreat, even in defeat, he tended to fight with a tactical competence that consistently impressed his Allied opponents. American officers in Normandy, in the Hürtgen Forest, in the Ardennes, and in the Rhineland filed report after report acknowledging the technical proficiency of the German enemy, even as they catalogued the steady erosion of his strategic position. But experience came at a cost. The faces of the men marching toward American lines in the spring of 1945 were not the faces of confident conquerors. They were thin. They were exhausted. Many of them were teenagers, 15 and 16 years old, hastily conscripted from the Hitler Youth and pushed into uniforms that hung from their narrow shoulders. Others were old men, fathers and grandfathers, in their 50s and 60s, called up under the Volkssturm decree that Hitler signed in late September 1944 and announced publicly on the 18th of October, when Germany began scraping together its last manpower from the only sources it had left. The middle, the men in their 20s and 30s who had once made up the heart of the Wehrmacht, had largely been consumed by the Eastern Front. The German soldier in 1945 was not the army of the early war years. He was its ghost. To understand why these men preferred surrender to one enemy over another, it is necessary to understand the nature of the war Germany had fought in the East. From the moment of the invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941, the conflict between Germany and Russia had been something different from the war Germany fought in the West. It was not a contest for territory or influence. It was, by explicit Nazi doctrine, a war of annihilation. Adolf Hitler had told his generals before the invasion began that the war in the East would be conducted with what he called unprecedented harshness. Officers were given verbal and written orders that suspended normal rules of warfare. The Commissar order required the immediate execution of captured Soviet political officers. The Barbarossa decree shielded German soldiers from prosecution for crimes committed against Soviet civilians. Behind the advancing armies came the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that murdered hundreds of thousands of Jewish civilians, Soviet officials, and Romani people in mass shootings across the occupied territories. Soviet prisoners of war suffered fates that defy easy description. Of the roughly 5.7 million Red Army soldiers captured by the Wehrmacht over the course of the war, more than 3 million died in German captivity, most of them from deliberate starvation, exposure, and shooting. They were herded into open-air enclosures with no shelter, no food, and almost no water. Photographs taken by German soldiers themselves show fields of emaciated men dying in the snow, watched by guards who made no attempt to feed them. The Soviet Union lost more than 27 million people during the war, of whom roughly two-thirds were civilians. The treatment of Soviet prisoners was not the work of a few criminal units. It was systematic, ordered from the top, and known throughout the German army. Camps such as Stalag 8B at Lambsdorff, later renumbered Stalag 344, and the adjacent Soviet camp Stalag 318 became death factories in everything but name. In the winter of 1941 to 1942 alone, an estimated 2 million Soviet prisoners died in German hands, many of them buried in mass graves that German soldiers themselves had been ordered to dig. Soviet villages were burned, Soviet women were raped, Soviet cities were starved. Leningrad endured a siege of nearly 900 days, 872 days to be exact, during which more than 1 million civilians died, many of them eating wallpaper paste and leather to survive. The German occupation of the Western Soviet Union was not a military operation in any traditional sense. It was a campaign of extermination directed at entire categories of human beings. The General Plan Ost, a long-range Nazi planning document, developed by the SS and various government agencies during the war, envisioned the eventual depopulation, deportation, or extermination of tens of millions of Slavic people across Eastern Europe to make room for German colonization. While the plan was never fully implemented, the policies that flowed from it, including forced labor deportations, mass starvation through food requisitioning, and the destruction of educated and professional classes, killed millions and shaped the daily reality of life under German occupation. Belarus alone lost approximately 1/4 of its entire pre-war population during the war, a casualty rate without parallel in modern European history. The men of the Wehrmacht knew what had been done in their name. Some had participated directly, many had watched, almost all had heard. And as the tide of war turned, beginning with the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad in February of 1943, every German soldier in the East began to understand a simple and terrible arithmetic. The Red Army was coming, and when it arrived, it would not be in a forgiving mood. Word of what happened when the Red Army did arrive spread through the German ranks faster than any official communication. On the 21st of October, 1944, Soviet troops briefly captured the East Prussian village of Nemmersdorf. When German forces retook the village days later, they found civilians dead, women raped, and a propaganda team from Berlin already on the way. The Nazi propaganda ministry seized on Nemmersdorf and broadcast its horrors across the Reich, often inflating the death toll and inventing specific atrocities that post-war scholarship has been unable to verify. But a massacre of civilians had unquestionably taken place. Modern research by the German historian Bernhard Fisch confirms that real killings occurred, even if not on the scale Goebbels claimed. From that moment forward, the question of what would happen if the Soviets reached the German heartland was no longer abstract. By January of 1945, the Soviet winter offensive had broken across the Vistula River with overwhelming force. More than 2 million Red Army soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of artillery pieces, smashed through the German defensive lines in Poland and East Prussia. The advance was so rapid that German civilian populations had no time to flee. What followed was one of the largest mass movements of human beings in modern history. Roughly 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans fled west during the final months of the war and the period immediately after. They came in carts pulled by exhausted horses, in trains packed beyond capacity, on foot with whatever possessions they could carry. Many died along the way of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Others were caught by the advancing Soviet troops. Estimates of German civilians who died during the flight and expulsions vary considerably. Older West German government figures from the 1950s placed the toll as high as 2 million. More recent academic research, drawing on archival evidence opened after 1989, has converged on a lower figure of roughly 500,000 to 600,000 confirmed deaths, with some scholars arguing for somewhat higher totals. What is not in dispute is that the violence inflicted on those who could not escape was systematic and widespread. Soviet soldiers, many of them veterans of years of brutal warfare, having seen what had been done to their own homeland, were given little restraint by their officers in the early weeks of the advance into Germany. The flight from East Prussia, in particular, became a defining tragedy of the war. The province had been Germany's easternmost territory, a land of farms, forests, and Baltic ports that had been part of the German-speaking world for 700 years. Beginning in the autumn of 1944 and accelerating into the winter of 1945, hundreds of thousands of East Prussian civilians attempted to flee west across the frozen Vistula Lagoon, a shallow bay covered with ice that became, for a few terrible weeks, a highway of refugees. Soviet aircraft strafed the columns. The ice cracked under overloaded carts. Children froze to death, sitting upright in their mothers' laps. The sinking of the German liner Wilhelm Gustloff in the Baltic Sea on the 30th of January, 1945, by a Soviet submarine, drowned an estimated 9,000 refugees, most of them women and children. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in human history, and almost no one outside of Germany has ever heard of it. Reports of mass rape began to filter back to the German lines almost immediately. Scholarly estimates of the scale vary considerably. Historians such as Anthony Beaver and Norman Naimark have placed the figure as high as 2 million German women raped by Soviet soldiers between January and the end of 1945, with about 100,000 cases in Berlin alone. More recent research by the German historian Miriam Gebhardt has offered a more conservative estimate of around 860,000. The range itself is staggering, and behind every figure stand individual women whose lives were violently broken. Cities were looted, property was burned. Men of military age were often shot on sight or marched east into Soviet labor camps, from which many would never return. These figures, harrowing as they are, do not capture the texture of what happened. Survivors described Soviet units rolling through villages in waves. The first wave, the combat troops, were generally too focused on the advance to commit widespread atrocities. The second wave, the rear echelon and supply units, was when the worst violence often occurred. Soviet officers attempted, with varying success, to restore discipline as the weeks passed. By the late spring of 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and other senior Soviet commanders had issued strict orders against rape and looting, and the violence diminished, though it never fully stopped during the occupation period. For the German soldier still holding a rifle on the Eastern Front, this knowledge was not rumor. It was reported by survivors who had escaped the Soviet advance. It was confirmed in letters from refugee relatives. It was visible in the columns of broken families streaming west through every road and rail line that still functioned. Every man in field grey understood, with absolute clarity, what surrender to the Red Army would likely mean. In the West, the situation was almost incomprehensibly different. When American forces had first encountered the Wehrmacht in significant numbers in North Africa in late 1942 and early 1943, both sides had been somewhat surprised by the relatively conventional character of the fighting. There were exceptions. There were atrocities committed by individual units on both sides. The Malmedy massacre of December 1944, in which German Waffen-SS troops murdered 84 American prisoners near the Belgian town of Borgnez, became infamous and shaped American attitudes for the remainder of the war. American troops, in scattered incidents, sometimes killed German prisoners in the immediate aftermath, particularly during the chaotic weeks following Malmedy. But these were aberrations within a broader pattern of relative restraint. The American military operated under the Geneva Convention, which the United States had ratified, and the basic principles of which were drilled into American soldiers and reinforced by an enormous and well-organized prisoner of war system. By 1945, the American Provost Marshal General's office was operating a network of camps that already housed more than 370,000 German prisoners on American soil, in facilities scattered across 46 states. These men received Red Cross packages, regular meals, medical care, and in many cases were paid for labor performed on American farms and in American factories. The American treatment of prisoners on home soil was, in many respects, remarkable. German prisoners shipped across the Atlantic from North Africa and Europe found themselves housed in barracks that were often newer and cleaner than the homes they had left behind. They ate meat, butter, fresh vegetables and white bread, foods that had become rare luxuries in wartime Germany. They worked in cotton fields in Texas, in lumber camps in Wisconsin, in canneries in California, and on farms across the Midwest, paid 80 cents a day in canteen scrip that they could spend on cigarettes, candy, and personal items. Some German prisoners later wrote that they had eaten better in American captivity than at any other point in their lives. A small number of these men, after the war, would emigrate to the United States and become American citizens. Many more, returning home to Germany in 1946 and 1947, brought with them an image of America that, however imperfect, had been formed not from propaganda, but from direct experience. They had seen American towns, eaten American food, talked with American civilians who had treated them with curiosity rather than hatred. This experience would shape post-war West German political attitudes for decades and would contribute meaningfully to the warmth of the American-German alliance during the Cold War. Letters from these prisoners reached Germany throughout the war, sometimes through neutral intermediaries, sometimes through the International Red Cross. The letters described a captivity that, while certainly not pleasant, was survivable. Men ate 3 meals a day. They were not beaten. They were not worked to death. Some were learning English. Some were attending lectures organized by American re-education programs. The contrast with what was happening to German soldiers captured in the East could not have been starker. The British operated similar systems, with prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Conditions in British camps were comparable to those in American camps, with similar adherence to Geneva Convention standards. Some British camps developed reputations for unusually humane treatment, with prisoners participating in local cultural events, attending religious services, and in some cases forming lasting friendships with British civilians who lived nearby. The historian Sir Anthony Beevor and others have documented dozens of cases of German prisoners who chose to remain in Britain after their formal release, marrying local women and establishing new lives in the country whose army they had once tried to destroy. By the spring of 1945, the German rumour mill had distilled this contrast into a kind of folk wisdom that ran through every unit on the Western Front. The Americans were tough fighters, but they followed rules. They took prisoners. They fed them. The British were similar. The French, who were now fighting their way into southern Germany after the liberation of their own country, were a more uncertain proposition, with a stronger appetite for revenge after years of occupation. But the Soviets were something else entirely. The Soviets were the consequence of what Germany had done, returning home. This understanding shaped German military behavior in ways that became increasingly visible as the war entered its final phase. Throughout the spring of 1945, German units that found themselves caught between American and Soviet forces engaged in deliberate, systematic efforts to surrender westward. They were not trying to escape the war. They had already lost the war, and they knew it. They were trying to choose their captor. The pattern repeated itself across the entire collapsing front. In late April, the German 12th Army, under General Walter Wenck, which had been ordered by Hitler to relieve Berlin, instead fought a desperate rearguard action whose primary purpose was not military victory, but to hold open a corridor through which civilians and soldiers could flee westward across the Elbe River into American captivity. Wenck's army covered the retreat of more than 250,000 German civilians and tens of thousands of soldiers from the remnants of the Ninth Army, all of them racing toward the American lines on the western bank. The scenes at the Elbe River crossings during the last days of April and the first days of May became some of the most extraordinary of the entire war. American troops of the Ninth Army held positions on the western bank near Tangermunde and Magdeburg. From the eastern bank, German soldiers, civilians, refugees, and stragglers from shattered units approached in waves. The Elbe Bridge at Tangermunde had been partially destroyed, but remained passable on foot. Day and night, the columns crossed, sometimes under Soviet artillery fire from positions that had pushed close to the eastern bank. American officers, having received no clear policy direction on what to do with the flood of humanity arriving at their lines, generally accepted the surrenders, processed who they could, and waved the rest through their lines toward holding areas in the rear. The German Ninth Army itself, encircled in the forests around the village of Halb southeast of Berlin, fought one of the war's last and most desperate breakout battles in late April 1945. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians attempted to push west through Soviet lines to reach Wenck's 12th Army, and beyond it, the Americans. Estimates of the dead in the Ruhr Pocket range from 20,000 to 40,000 soldiers and civilians, killed in artillery barrages, ambushes, and small unit combat in the dense pine forests. Those who survived the breakout reached American lines exhausted, traumatized, and almost without exception expressing gratitude that they had crossed into American captivity rather than Soviet. In the south, German units in Bavaria and Austria began surrendering en masse to American forces in the first days of May. Entire regiments laid down their weapons in towns and villages without a shot fired. American officers found themselves accepting the surrender of formations that, by the standards of even 6 months earlier, would have fought to the last man. On the 5th of May at Haar in Bavaria, General Hermann Foch signed the unconditional surrender of Army Group G to General Jacob Devers, commander of the 6th United States Army Group. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who held overall command of German forces in the Southern Theatre, surrendered separately 4 days later in Austria. Within days of these capitulations, more than 700,000 additional German soldiers had passed into American captivity in the Southern Theatre alone. In the north, German naval personnel and Luftwaffe ground crews crossed makeshift bridges over rivers to reach British positions. The German forces in northwestern Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark surrendered to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery on the 4th of May at Lüneburg Heath, in a brief and businesslike ceremony in a tent. The surrender was signed by Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg on behalf of all German forces in those regions. Estimates of the number of troops covered by that single signature range from over 500,000 to more than 1 million, depending on how peripheral and disorganized units are counted. In Czechoslovakia, German soldiers fought rearguard actions against the Red Army not to win, but to delay the Soviet advance long enough to walk west into the American zone. The American Third Army under General George Patton had been ordered to halt at the prearranged demarcation line running through Carlsbad, Pilsen, and Budweis. But isolated German units kept walking west across the line for days afterward, hoping to be captured by Americans rather than wait for Soviet troops to arrive. The Soviets were not unaware of what was happening. As the war ended and in the weeks that followed, Soviet authorities pressed their American counterparts hard for the return of German military personnel who had escaped westward. Under the agreements reached at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, both sides had pledged to return each other's nationals. In practice, the Western Allies cooperated selectively, sometimes returning soldiers of Soviet ethnic origin who had fought for Germany, while protecting most German nationals who had reached the Western lines. By the time the official surrender was signed at Reims on the 7th of May and ratified at Berlin on the 8th, the Western Allies had taken in roughly 3 to 3.5 million German prisoners. The Soviet Union had captured roughly 2.5 to 3 million. The Western total grew rapidly in the immediate aftermath of the war, as soldiers continued to walk in and turn themselves over. The decision of millions of individual German soldiers to surrender westward had reshaped the post-war map in ways that none of the planners at Yalta or Potsdam had fully anticipated. Of all these surrenders, none was larger or more revealing than the collapse of the Ruhr Pocket. The Ruhr was the industrial heart of Germany, a dense web of coal mines, steel mills, and weapons factories that had armed the Wehrmacht for 6 years of war. By the spring of 1945, much of it lay in ruins from years of Allied bombing, but the factories that survived were still producing. The Ruhr was the prize that General Dwight Eisenhower's strategic plan had targeted for encirclement, and on the 1st of April, American forces had closed the ring around it. The closing of the ring was itself a remarkable feat of military execution. The American Ninth Army, under General William Simpson, which had been temporarily attached to Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group for the Rhine crossing in March, drove south from positions north of the Ruhr. The American First Army under General Courtney Hodges drove north from positions south of the Ruhr. The two armies met near the town of Lippstadt on the 1st of April, sealing inside their encirclement an enormous concentration of German forces, factories, and civilians. 3 days later, Simpson's Ninth Army reverted to General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, and the reduction of the pocket became an entirely American operation. It was the largest single envelopment ever conducted by American forces, and one of the largest in the entire history of warfare. Inside the pocket were the remnants of Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model. Model was one of the most respected German generals of the war, a master of defensive operations who had earned the nickname the Führer's Fireman for his repeated ability to stabilize crumbling fronts. He had been ordered by Hitler to defend the Ruhr to the last man, to turn it into a fortress, to deny the Allies its industrial capacity. Model attempted, in a limited way, to obey. But his army had been fighting for too long, his supply lines were severed, his men were starving, his ammunition was running out. Model commanded, on paper, more than 300,000 soldiers, including elements of the 5th Panzer Army and the 15th Army. In reality, his force was a patchwork of battered combat units, rear echelon troops, anti-aircraft personnel hastily reorganized as infantry, Volkssturm militia, and clerks pressed into the line. Many had no proper weapons, many had not eaten properly in weeks. Civilians caught inside the pocket numbered in the millions, including workers in the still operating factories and refugees who had fled westward from the advancing Soviets. The American advance into the pocket was not a single battle but a constant, grinding pressure from multiple directions. The 1st and 9th Armies pushed inward from the north and south, supported by overwhelming air power and artillery. German units were sliced apart, encircled within the encirclement, and offered surrender terms that, by any rational measure, were generous. American officers brought in loudspeaker trucks that broadcast surrender invitations in German across the lines. Leaflets fluttered down from spotter planes, promising fair treatment, food, and medical care to those who laid down their arms. For Field Marshal Model, surrender was not an option he could allow himself to take. He had once written that a field marshal does not become a prisoner, but he made a quiet decision that would shape the lives of hundreds of thousands of men under his command. On the 15th of April, he issued an order that effectively dissolved Army Group B as a fighting formation. The youngest soldiers and the oldest were to be discharged outright and sent home. The remainder were released from their oath, free to surrender as they saw fit. It was an extraordinary act, almost without precedent in German military history. Model was, in effect, telling his men to save themselves, and they did. Over the following days, the Ruhr Pocket dissolved, not in a final battle, but in a great quiet folding inward. American units found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of men coming forward to surrender. Roads were jammed with columns of disarmed soldiers walking westward under their own direction, accompanied by token American escorts. Field kitchens could not produce food fast enough. Holding pens overflowed and spilled into open fields ringed with concertina wire. American military police struggled to manage the flow. In some places, the ratio of prisoners to guards reached 100 to 1 or higher. The American troops, for their part, found themselves in a strange position. They had spent years training and fighting to defeat these men. Now they were sharing cigarettes with them, pointing them toward water sources, helping them find shade. The German soldiers, in turn, were often visibly relieved, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing, in a manner that suggested the release of unbearable tension. American soldiers in their letters home described the scenes with a mixture of pity, contempt, and unexpected sympathy. The enemy they had been told to fear had turned out, in the end, to be hungry teenagers and exhausted middle-aged men, all of them desperate simply to live. By the 18th of April, when organized resistance inside the pocket had effectively ended, the American command had stopped trying to count individuals and started counting in tens of thousands. The final tally for the Ruhr Pocket would reach somewhere between 317,000 and 325,000 surrendered German troops, depending on which official tally is used, along with 24 to 30 general officers. It was a larger capture of German soldiers than Stalingrad and Tunis combined. It was the largest surrender of a German army in the history of the war. Walter Model, having dissolved his army, spent his last days wandering with a small staff in the woods between Duisburg and the village of Lintorf, in what is today the city of Rattingen. On the 21st of April, he walked a short distance from his aides, drew his service pistol, and shot himself in the head. He was buried at the spot by his staff officer, in an unmarked grave. His remains were exhumed in 1955 by his son Hansgorg, later himself a brigadier general in the Bundeswehr, and reburied in the German military cemetery at Vossenack in the Hürtgen forest. The men he had freed from their oath went west and lived. The decision to surrender to one enemy rather than another had consequences that played out over years and in some cases decades. The men who reached American captivity in the spring of 1945 entered a system that, while imperfect and at times harsh, was fundamentally oriented toward eventual release. The Western Allies faced a logistical crisis of staggering proportions. They had expected to take perhaps a few 100,000 prisoners during the final campaigns. They ended up taking more than 5 million across all theaters by the early summer. To manage this overflow, General Eisenhower invoked a legal classification called disarmed enemy forces, a status distinct from prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. The justification was logistical. The Geneva Convention required prisoners to be fed at the same standard as the captor's own troops, a standard that simply could not be met for so many men in a war-torn Europe with collapsing food supplies. Conditions in the American run camps along the Rhine, known to history as the Rheinwiesenlager or Rhine Meadow camps, were severe in the spring and early summer of 1945. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were held in open fields ringed with barbed wire, often without shelter, with limited food, and with inadequate sanitation. Estimates of deaths in these camps vary considerably. Mainstream historical estimates, including those of the West German Maschke Commission and the historian Rüdiger Overmans, place the total at between roughly 3,000 and 10,000 deaths from disease, malnutrition, and exposure. The broadest possible reading, including all transit camps and French-run successor camps, has been estimated at up to 56,000. The Canadian author James Back proposed a far higher figure of nearly 1 million deaths, accusing General Eisenhower of deliberate mass murder. Those claims have been comprehensively rejected by mainstream historians, including a 1991 academic conference at the University of New Orleans organized by Stephen Ambrose, which concluded that Bakke had misused and misread documents and ignored contrary evidence. By comparison, of the approximately 2.5 to 3 million German soldiers taken prisoner by the Soviet Union, somewhere between 350,000 and 1 million died in captivity, depending on the methodology. The last German prisoners of war held in the Soviet Union were not released until 1955, fully 10 years after the war ended. Many of them had been held in Siberian labor camps, working in conditions that killed thousands more after the formal end of the war. The German soldier who surrendered to the Americans in 1945 was, in the great majority of cases, home within a year. Some were released within weeks if they were judged to be of no security interest and were needed for agricultural work. Others spent longer periods in camps in France or the Low Countries, where conditions were sometimes harsher than in American zones. But the trajectory was always toward release, toward returning to whatever was left of a German civilian life. The German soldier who surrendered to the Soviets in 1945 often did not see his family again until the middle of the 1950s. Many never saw them again at all. There has been debate, then and since, about whether the conditions in the Rhine-Wiesenlager constituted a war crime or a moral failure on the part of the American command. Some historians have argued that Eisenhower's invocation of the disarmed enemy forces classification was a deliberate effort to deny the Geneva Convention's protections to German prisoners. Others have argued that it was a pragmatic response to an impossible logistical situation in a continent where millions of civilians were also starving. The most rigorous studies have concluded that conditions were genuinely terrible in the spring of 1945, that they improved substantially by the autumn, and that the death rates, while tragic, were not the result of deliberate policy comparable to what Soviet prisoners had experienced in German hands, or what German prisoners experienced in Soviet hands. What is not contested is that the German soldiers who chose to walk west in the spring of 1945 made a choice that, on average, gave them a far better chance of survival, of return, and of resuming a life. They had read the situation correctly. They had judged the relative mercy of their two possible captors with grim, accurate clarity. The decisions made by individual German soldiers in the final weeks of the war shaped the post-war settlement in ways that historians are still working to fully understand. The fact that the bulk of the surviving Wehrmacht ended up in Western captivity rather than Soviet captivity meant that, when the time came to begin rebuilding Germany, a critical mass of trained, skilled men was available in the Western occupation zones. These men became workers, engineers, technicians, and eventually, as the Cold War deepened, soldiers again in the new West German Bundeswehr, established in 1955. The transformation of the German soldier from defeated enemy to Cold War ally was one of the most rapid political reversals in modern history. Within 10 years of the end of the war, former Wehrmacht officers were sitting in NATO headquarters, planning the defense of Western Europe against the same Soviet army that had crushed them in 1945. General Hans Speidel, who had been chief of staff to Field Marshal Rommel in Normandy, became one of the first generals of the Bundeswehr and went on to serve as Supreme Commander of NATO Allied Land Forces Central Europe from 1957 to 1963. General Adolf Heusinger, who had served as Chief of Operations of the German Army High Command for much of the war, became the first Inspector General of the Bundeswehr and later Chairman of the NATO Military Committee in Washington. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who had commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, served as a member of the West German Bundestag and is credited with having proposed the very name Bundeswehr. The institutional knowledge these men brought, combined with the practical experience of millions of former soldiers now reintegrated into West German civilian life, gave the new Federal Republic a depth of military and technical expertise that no other defeated nation in modern history had been able to mobilize so quickly. The Soviet zone followed a different trajectory. The German Democratic Republic, established in 1949, eventually created its own military force, the National People's Army, formally founded in 1956, and drawing on former Wehrmacht personnel, along with veterans of the barracked People's Police. But the East German state was constrained by its dependence on Moscow and by the much smaller pool of returned veterans available to it. The men who had been held in Soviet captivity until 1955 returned home, older, more broken, and often more politically suspect than their counterparts who had returned from American or British camps a decade earlier. The contrast between the two post-war German states reflected, in part, the different fates of the men who had made up the army of 1945. The flight westward also reshaped the demographic future of divided Germany. The territories east of the Oder and Neisse rivers, which had been German for centuries, became Polish or Soviet. The roughly 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans who fled or were expelled from these regions and from the Sudetenland and other areas of Eastern Europe overwhelmingly settled in the Western occupation zones. They brought with them not only their labor and their skills, but also their memories. Their stories of what had happened in the East shaped West German political culture for generations. For the families of men who surrendered to the Soviets, the wait was often agonizing. Wives and mothers received occasional postcards from prison camps deep inside Russia. Some arrived years late. Some arrived once and then stopped, leaving families uncertain for the rest of their lives whether the writer was alive or dead. The German Red Cross continued tracing missing soldiers into the 1970s and beyond. The economic miracle of West Germany in the 1950s and 1960s, the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, he was built in significant part by men who had been Wehrmacht soldiers in 1945 and had walked west to surrender. They returned to a ruined country, took jobs in factories and mines and offices, and over a remarkably short period helped rebuild Germany into the economic engine of post-war Europe. None of this would have been possible if the same men had spent the next decade in Siberian labor camps. The choice they made in the spring of 1945 was, in this sense, a choice that benefited not only them, but the entire post-war German economy and the political stability of Western Europe. The American camps emptied steadily through the autumn and winter of 1945 and the spring of 1946. Men were given papers, train tickets, and small allowances of food and money, and sent home to villages and cities they often barely recognized. Some came home to find that their families had been killed in Allied bombing raids. Some came home to find their houses occupied by refugees from the East. Some came home and found that their wives had remarried, believing them dead. But they came home. They could begin again, in whatever form beginning again was still possible. The men who walked out of the Ruhr Pocket in April of 1945 with their hands raised made a choice that was, in its own quiet way, one of the most consequential mass decisions of the 20th century. They chose to be the first generation of post-war Germans rather than to disappear into the camps of the East. They chose survival over the soldiers' traditional ideal of fighting to the last bullet. In doing so, they ensured that there would be a Germany to rebuild, a Germany capable of becoming, eventually, the democratic and prosperous nation that emerged from the ruins. Today, the Ruhr Valley is a region of universities, parks, and converted industrial heritage sites. The factories that once produced tanks and shells are mostly gone, replaced by office complexes and museums. In Iserlohn, in Hagen, in Solingen and Duisburg, the streets that once filled with surrendering soldiers are ordinary streets again, lined with cafes and shops and homes. Visitors can walk the paths through the woods near Lintorf, where Walter Model ended his life, or visit the German military cemetery at Vossenack, where he is buried alongside thousands of his men. The Rheinwiesenlager sites along the Rhine are mostly farmland again. A few of them have small memorials, simple stone markers acknowledging that men once lived and died in those fields. The larger story is told in museums in Bad Kreuznach and elsewhere, where photographs and documents preserve the memory of what happened in those crowded enclosures during a long and difficult summer. The men who went east, who surrendered to the Red Army, have their own memorials. There are cemeteries scattered across what was once the Soviet Union, marking the places where German prisoners died in mines and forests and labor camps. The German War Graves Commission has spent decades identifying remains and notifying families. The work is ongoing. New graves are still being identified. The story of why German soldiers preferred surrendering to Americans in 1945 is not, in the end, a story about the Americans. It is a story about choices made in the worst of circumstances by men who had themselves participated in or stood witness to terrible things. It is a story about the way a war fought without restraint generates its own consequences, consequences that travel back along the lines of advance and find the soldiers who started them. The men of the Wehrmacht in 1945 understood, in a way that few generations of soldiers have ever understood, that they were facing the return of what they had done. They tried, in the only way still available to them, to find a captor who would treat them better than they had treated others. Most of them succeeded. The last German prisoners of war returned from the Soviet Union in October of 1955, 10 years and 5 months after the official end of the war. Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of West Germany, had travelled to Moscow personally to negotiate their release. When the trains carrying them crossed the border at Friedland, crowds of relatives waited at the station with photographs of the men they hoped to see, some of those photographs taken nearly 15 years earlier. There were reunions on the platform that had been waited for through more than half a generation. There were also relatives who held photographs and waited and saw no familiar face, who learned that day or in the weeks that followed that the man they had hoped for would not be coming. The German soldier of 1945 had done what he could. He had read the writing on the walls of the world he had helped to make, and he had walked, when he could walk, toward the lines that offered the best chance of returning. He could not undo what had been done. He could not bring back the millions who had died in the East at his army's hands. He could only choose, in that final spring, who would receive him. And in that choice he showed a clarity that all the propaganda and ideology of the previous 12 years had failed to suppress. It was the clearest thinking the German soldier had done in a very long time. And it saved most of the lives it could still save.